Delighted that she's made time in her schedule. Please welcome neuroscientist
Aubrey Gilbert. I brought a brain. Hi. So I was a little bit nervous getting up here tonight, feeling kind of scattered after working a 14-hour day in the hospital and then having about 20 rolls of leftover Smarties for dinner. But my husband pointed out that in a talk about epic fail, there really is very little way to go wrong. He also suggested that if I had too much time left over, I could accidentally fall off the stage. So tonight I want to talk about what I perceive to be one of the greatest epic fails in neuroscience, the frontal lobotomy. And it has a very interesting history. But because that story is not very personal, and also because I unfortunately was able to come up with a long laundry list of personal examples of epic fail, I thought I should at least share a couple. So the first thing I thought of when I was invited to give a talk on epic fail was a recent trip I took to Big Bend National Park, which is actually in Texas. And I have this group of friends from grad school in Berkeley that we try to go backpacking as frequently as possible. And it's kind of tapered off over the years, but our plan was to go backpacking over New Year's. And we really just wanted to go somewhere warm. So we tried to find the most southern national park in the US, and it turned out it was in Texas. And yeah, we have Tex in here. So we flew into El Paso, which is one of the closest airports, which was still a roughish 4-hour drive away from the national park. And we had this long drive to get through and pretty much nothing on the road in between. And so I was trying to pass the time, and I decided to tell my friends this story about how I had recently heard that there had been funding cuts to education in the state of Texas. And this was very sad. But as a result, teachers in the El Paso area no longer had enough time to do formal grading. And instead, they had decided to substitute this simple system that took less time. They were going to label papers as either El Paso or El Falo. So now you know my sense of humor. This phrase, though, El Falo, kind of became our catch thing during our trip. And we actually had too many instances to use it. It turns out Texas, although southern, also has mountains. It was really cold over New Year's there. We also got to use our phrase after buying a big chunk of queso fresco and then leaving it in the car for the 4 days while we were out backpacking at El Falo. Also, trying to harvest wild prickly pears and then spending about 2 hours sitting on the side of the trail with your little first aid kit tweezers. There's a reason they call them prickly pears. El Falo. So there are so many stories about failures in medical school. It's a place where lots of interesting things happen. And I had to pick from a few different stories, but the recurring theme that kept on coming up was that going to medical school really makes you a little bit of a hypochondriac. You're learning all of these different symptoms that patients have, and your entire perspective gets skewed because you're seeing sick people every day, and you're surrounded by disease, and you think, I must have something to do. And I can't tell you how many times I would go to the student health, and they call it med-studentitis. There's actually a term for it. I would go to student health, I was convinced I had an aortic dissection, which ended up being gas. That happened more than once. But it wasn't just me. I was convinced that other people around me also had diseases. And this was in part due to the fact that my mother, whose sense of humor is worse than mine, got it in her head that, oh, this is really funny. Aubrey is hypochondriac and I have the internet. So I would get a call from her, nonchalantly checking in how she was doing. How are you doing? Oh, I've been having some jaw pain. Oh, really? Oh yeah, I've been having some fevers too. Otherwise, my vision is kind of spotty. And she's listing all of the symptoms. She's looked up for polymyalgia rheumatica with giant cell arteritis, these random diseases. She thinks it's really funny. Go to the doctor! So Needless to say, I had my husband visit his doctor a number of times, and this one time I had just spent 2 weeks in dermatology clinic, and you do full body skin check, full body skin check, full body skin check. It's really funny actually, because you're having patients flip over a lot, and I had this one resident who English wasn't his first language, and he didn't realize it, but every time he would tell a patient, "Okay, now can you please a rotisserie?" They just kept on doing it, they got it. But I was convinced, so my husband and I are lying in bed one night, and I look over, and he has this black spot on his ear, and I think, oh God. And I've just learned the ABCDs, whatever, figuring out melanoma, I'm like, this is a new spot, it's got irregular margins, the color is all strange, and I thought, he has a melanoma in his ear. And so I'm stressing about this all week, and luckily I have a lot of post-medical school friends who have all gone into different specialties. And so I can kind of curbside consult them on things, and I'm at this cocktail party with him one week at a friend's house, and my friend Iris, who's becoming a dermatologist, is there, and I said, Iris, I need to ask your opinion on this. I'm really worried about this spot on my husband's ear. And she has her wine, and she walks over, and she kind of looks at my husband's ear. She looks at it, and she puts her wine down, she takes her little finger, and she scrapes up this big chunk of dirt. That was embarrassing for both of us. But I want to talk about frontal lobotomy, really. That's why I got the break. So in order to understand frontal lobotomy, I want to tell you just a very brief history of brain surgery. It's been going on for a lot longer than you think. Brain surgery dates back even to times like 7000 BC. No, how did they do brain surgery back then? But it turns out that skulls have been found in caves in France that show evidence of not only damage to the skull, but also healing after that damage, giving evidence that the patient lived past the actual surgery, which is kind of incredible. And in fact, there's a lot of accounts in ancient Egypt. They had this very intricate mummification process of what they would do with the brains. So in your head right now, your brain is roughly the consistency of unset Jell-O. It really is. And it's kind of cushioned by lots of fluid, but head banging is not a very good idea. It's just very soft in there. But what they would do with the mummies was they had a very special tool that basically was like a crochet hook. And after the mummies were dead and other things were being done, they would insert this crochet hook through the nose. There's a very thin cribiform plate that you can just poke right through into the brain. And they kind of swirl it around, which you can imagine with unset Jell-O would liquefy it. They turn the mummy over on its front and then drain the brains out the nose. That's not brain surgery, right? I mean, people have been doing these things for a long time. But we first started doing, localized brain surgery a little bit later. Maybe, I bet a lot of you have heard the story of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was this railroad worker in the This is the problem with not being able to use notes. I also am used to talking with slides. But he was a railroad worker in New England. And basically he was tamping down a railroad iron one day, going about his railroad worker way, and boom, there was a big explosion, and the railroad iron went back up and shot through his skull. And amazingly, he lived through this. And the damage was to his frontal lobes from this accident. And now, you have to understand what the frontal lobes do to understand what happened next. So the frontal lobes, maybe you've heard, are kind of part of what makes us human. There's a thing that separates us from the rest of the animals, in that it has higher order, we call them executive functions. So things like planning ahead and delaying gratification and all these sort of higher order functions. Also, your social braces. No way. I don't have to fall off the stage. That's really good. Anyway, I'm going to make a long story short. He became very disinhibited, and this very proper guy started to become quite randy. Well, the idea of doing brain surgery kind of developed into this thing, and I want to get to Walter Freeman, and I'm just going to talk about him very briefly because he was the epic fail in this story. He was a little bit of a zealot neuropsychiatrist who thought that he could help psychiatric patients in the 1940s and 50s by doing a procedure called a frontal lobotomy. And he basically developed a way to do it using an ice pick from his kitchen drawer. And it used to be that the frontal lobotomy had to be done in an anesthetized patient who was in a hospital, but he made it so it could be done in an office. And he would insert, I mean, it's, you know, revisit what I just said about the mummies and the nose just go through the eye. And basically he'd go in there and kind of swish it around on both sides. And he got to be a zealot because it started off with just psychiatric patients who had no other options, but he was doing it on kids with what would have been diagnosed as ADHD today, women with what would have been diagnosed as postpartum depression. He was starting to make a name for himself, and he drove across the country in this lobotomobile, he called it, and performed this personally on 3,500 different patients. And there are very interesting pieces on NPR that you can hear about patients who had this done when they were young children and how their lives changed. When you take away the frontal lobes, you take away who a person is. You take away their personality, their drive, all of these things. So he actually performed his last surgery after causing a big cerebral hemorrhage in this poor woman, and that was the end of him. Also around that time, thorazine was being introduced, and it was the very first big antipsychotic drug we had. So the morals of these stories, I don't want to go over time, but one, and I had so many other interesting things to say. Anyway, one, don't ever let yourself be lobotomized. And two, it's probably just gas.